So we are talking about observational method. Observational studies advantage and benefit becomes most clear or clearest and most prevalent when you try to observe people or animals in the natural setting without any isolation of variables, without any control or any manipulation. Related to the previous slide where the advantage of observational study is best accomplished by natural observation. So the key idea or the goal of observation, in particular natural observation, is rich description of how people behave in the natural setting. So therefore, the goal is description, not explanation. It cannot accomplish explanation because you don't have any control or manipulation of what's causing the particular kinds of psychological phenomenon or behavior. As an example of study using observation, I'm going to give you this example of a study called Rosenhan study on psychiatric institution. You can find a PDF version of the original article following this link. So the question they explore is whether the professionals in psychiatric institutions can distinguish between sane and insane people in the institution. Rosenhan study happened in 1970s in the context where many people are questioning the legitimacy or the way in which psychiatric institutions are run. So in order to see what's actually going on in the psychiatric institution, they selected 12 different hospitals, psychiatric hospitals across the United States. And they made an appointment, and there are 8 sane people, that's 3 psychologists or 1 psychiatrist, 1 pediatrician, 1 housewife, and 1 painter was sent or actually get into the psychiatric institution as a pseudo patient, and then they observe what's going on. All 8 follow the same pre-made instructions, complained only of hearing voice that said empty, hollow, and fat when they called a psychiatric institution. And other than that, all subjects acted normally and gave truthful information. But in the meantime, they observed what's going on in the hospital. So here I'm describing overall finding based on these observations, so such as length of hospital stay, which is an average of 19 days, even though all these people are sane. And none were detected as a pseudo patients, 1 diagnosed with schizophrenia, and 7 diagnosed with schizophrenia in remission. This means these people are all normal without any psychological disorder. So it's a lot of misdiagnosis. And contacts between patient and hospital staff were described as minimal and bizarre. So that's the main finding. So given the previous description contained in the previous slide, we should think a little bit about the strengths and weakness. So strengths of this study is obviously based on the facts that these are the description of the people and things that's going on in the real hospitals. So it's not in the lab. Okay, and then also it contained a lot of rich description. Even though I didn't put all these details, the data has a lot of different kinds of description about how hospital workers and patient interacted. The weakness, on the other hand, is it does not provide any explanation on why this is actually happening in the hospital. Okay. Also, it suffers, it's short in reliability. We can't really figure out how consistent this phenomenon are across the different hospitals in the United States because sample size is small. And also it's based on the single patient. Okay, so these are the kind of things that you can see, and you should have some kind of, at least some idea about how observational study work, and it doesn't. So observational study can result or emphasize quantitative or qualitative approach. Quantitative means you try to describe the people's behavior using numerical values such as what's the percentage of people responded in this way, how long did it take for a person to complete certain actions, what's the most frequent or least frequent behavior. On the other hand, the qualitative approach is more like a diary where you describe what you observe. So such as detailed description of the behaviors, exactly how they did, or what their belief is like. So there is one interesting study that I encountered is a study by Lozaldo on Ilongots. This is a particular tribe or group living in Philippines who practice headhunting. And they have an insight of what drove them to do headhunting and in what situation they do and their internal belief and so on. So that's described in the narrative description. Even though there are many different kinds of observational studies, the most extreme with the least control of the method is the naturalistic observation. And typically it involves field work or field observation. You observe and record people's behavior in a particular setting. So I think the textbook described one of the example famous study by Sylvia Scrivener, who actually documented and observed the people in the workplace. The purpose of this study is to understand how people operate and function in the natural environment, which is typically complex, and as it is. And so it emphasizes something called ecological validity. So it's a natural setting, and it provides rich description of the behaviors observed. So you should note that this is different from hypothesis testing. You shouldn't have clear hypothesis. You should be open to observing everything as a data. So typical method of natural observation is you have to observe. Okay, in the observation phase, you take a detailed notes. Okay, and then you typically develop the specific note taking technique to allow rapid recording of what you observe. You also use recording devices and a collection of many different kinds of artifacts. So you shouldn't be biased. You shouldn't be driven by a hypothesis. You try to observe as neutrally as possible and record everything that you see. Analysis phase of the natural observation is a complicated one because as we talked, you have to observe and record everything. So your data contains a lot of noise and lots of things that it may not be really relevant to your eventual conclusion. But so in the processes, you have to actually transform and abstract and classify these findings into something that's more coherent and understandable and meaningful. Okay, so so this means you have to have some sort of coding system that allow you to categorize the behaviors and the artifacts and everything that you observe. And then here, what's important is in order to actually make it as objective as possible of the interpretation of what you observe, you have to have multiple coders to establish the inter-data reliability of the meaning of your observed behavior. And you probably need to do multiple cycles to kind of narrow down your interpretation to create the consistent and coherent narrative of what you found. Even though researchers try to be neutral and open-minded about everything, the people are often biased toward what they previously believed. So this is called the confirmatory bias. So in order to actually prevent confirmatory bias to influence your eventual conclusion and interpretation of what you found, researchers often conduct something called negative or deviant case analysis. So here I describe it. Essentially, negative case analysis means in order to prevent cherry picking the data just to confirm what you believe, you are going to look at the cases to really exhaustively see are there any observation that contradicts the hypothesis or theory that's being actually developed in the course of analysis. In this way, your observation or interpretation of the observation becomes much more reliable and trustworthy without any cherry-picked understanding of the complex situations. One noteworthy issue that you need to think about at the time you conduct natural observation or naturalistic observation is how you are going to position yourself as observer. There are two choices. One extreme is you become participant. So that means you're going to do your best to be accepted as the member of the society or community that you're trying to observe. So in that way, the reason why you need to be accepted as a member of society or community is to minimize the reactivity. Let's imagine that if you are observing the people visibly and they become aware that you're observing it, that's very likely to result in the activity measure because it influences presence of the observer influence the people's behavior. Okay, so the other extreme choice is then, therefore, is a concealment. That means you're going to conceal yourself and let's say secret camera or recording device to record what people are doing. But then there is an ethical issue. There is a privacy violation of privacy. Okay. The other things that you need to think about in case that you decide to do participant observation is, in case that you spend too much time with the people, you start adapting or putting yourself into their perspective. But your job is to be neutral. Okay, so that's where the difficulty and kind of the challenge happens. Okay, so all these things need to be carefully thought about and considered before you conduct observational research. So overall, observational research is, especially the natural observation, is very challenging. It's a limitation based on researchers' information processing capacity. Obviously, you cannot observe everything. Also, it's expensive. You have to have multiple observers, you have to have instruments, it's time consuming because you try to observe everything. Okay. Systematic observation is more focused and a compact version of observation. In natural observation, you observe the just natural setting as it is. In systematic observation, you set up the setting. So it's in between experiment. Let's say you're going to give a particular activity to a participant in a particular condition. And then you observe how they do a task or how do they do their activities. And one interesting method in cognitive psychology that we typically use is something called think aloud analysis. That means, let's say that I ask you to solve a particular kind of program. In the course of solving the program, I asked participants to verbalize their thinking, ongoing thought process aloud so that I can record and have an access to the thought process. Okay, and so the issues or the limitation related to systematic observation is very similar to natural observation, and I'm listing it here. Case study is a detailed and intensive descriptive study of individual case. It can be a group. So an example is a psychobiography, which is an application of psychological theory to explain life of usually famous individual. Archival research or analysis can be also categorized as a specific case of observational research. So the example of this class of research includes statistical records, like a baseball stats, census data, population maps that you are going to reanalyze it, or survey archives, or content analysis of documents. One thing that I did is there is a standardized testing of reading comprehension test. I analyze the content of the test and try to relate it to understand the difficulty level of each question. That's the example of archival research. I didn't have to use any participants. The data are all available there. You just employ your analytical skill to analyze the content of the document.